At 7:32 a.m. on February 10, 1942, Lieutenant Commander John S. Thach watched 6 Japanese Zeros diving toward his 4 Wildcats over Wake Island, knowing his pilots had maybe 90 seconds before they died. He was 37 years old, with 200 flight hours in the F4F Wildcat and 0 kills against Zeros. The math was simple, brutal, and well-known to both sides. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero could outclimb, outturn, and out-accelerate anything the U.S. Navy had in the air. Its lightweight design, 52-foot wingspan, and phenomenal lift-to-weight ratio gave it a turning radius 40% tighter than the Wildcats. Japanese pilots could literally fly circles around their American opponents, and they knew it. By that February morning, the Pacific Fleet had lost 43 Wildcats in one-on-one combat with Zeros, 43 pilots who tried to turn, who trusted instinct instead of geometry, 43 funerals. The pattern never changed. An American pilot spotted a Zero, turned to engage, and the Zero simply outturned him, lined up its Type 99 20mm cannons, and shredded him in seconds. Command's standing orders were plain: avoid turning engagements, run if possible. But running meant abandoning fellow pilots. Running meant leaving your squadron mates to die. For men like Thach, a veteran instructor, husband, and leader, those orders felt like surrender. He commanded Fighting Squadron 3, VF3, 4 Wildcats, 4 men who trusted him to keep them alive. But he had no solution for the Zero's superior climb rate or turn radius. None, until a sleepless night at Naval Air Station San Diego 3 days earlier. That night, Thach sat in his small quarters, staring at a simple object, a cardboard matchbox his wife had mailed from home. 20 wooden matches, no different from any other, except that to him they had become a puzzle. For weeks he had been thinking about one question: how do you beat an enemy who outperforms you in every metric? He'd spent hours analyzing aerial gunnery data, engine torque reports, roll rates, and turn speeds. The numbers offered no comfort. The Zero could complete a 360-degree turn in 14 seconds. The Wildcat needed almost 20. Even with heavier armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, a Wildcat in a dogfight was a doomed aircraft. Then, staring at the matches, he had an idea. Thach picked up 2 and held them parallel, sliding them past each other in a weaving motion, crossing, recrossing, never separating. What if, he wondered, 2 Wildcats didn't fight as individuals? What if they fought as one system, overlapping their fields of fire, covering each other's tails? He imagined the geometry in 3 dimensions. If a Zero latched onto one Wildcat's 6 o'clock position, that Wildcat could turn toward his wingman, while the wingman turned toward him. Their crossing paths would force the pursuer to fly straight into the other Wildcat's guns. It was insane by 1942 standards. It violated every line of the U.S. Navy fighter doctrine manual. Pilots were trained to break into single combats once an engagement began. Pair flying was for navigation, not for combat. But doctrine had been written for the skies of 1918, not for a new kind of enemy with extraordinary agility and discipline. Thach couldn't stop thinking about the matches, about the 43 pilots dead that month. His instincts as an instructor told him that tactics could solve what technology couldn't. A tactic that forced the enemy to commit, to chase into a kill zone, might equalize the fight. He called in his wingman, Lieutenant Edward Butch O'Hare, one of the youngest and sharpest pilots in the Navy. O'Hare had a natural feel for air combat and an engineer's mind for geometry. Thach showed him the two matches on the table, explained the weaving motion, and laid out his reasoning. O'Hare watched, silent, for 30 seconds. Then he looked up and asked one question. When do we test it? 4 days later, Thach would find out. The morning over Wake Island was quiet until it wasn't. The radar picked up enemy contacts at 11,000 feet. 18 Zeros inbound, flying a textbook Japanese fighter sweep to clear the skies for bombers. Thach's section of 4 Wildcats climbed to intercept. His hand tightened around the control stick. The F4F's Pratt & Whitney R1830 engine roared, straining to gain altitude. He knew every number by heart. The Zero's climb rate, 3,100 feet per minute. The Wildcats, barely 2,000. He couldn't outclimb them. He couldn't outturn them. But maybe, just maybe, he could outthink them. The Zeros spotted them first. 6 peeled off, diving from above in perfect formation. Thach had 90 seconds before impact. Standard doctrine said to scatter and fight individually. Instead, Thach did something no U.S. Navy pilot had ever ordered in combat. He pressed the transmit key. Bassett on me. Weave pattern. Execute. Lieutenant, junior grade. Edward Bassett was 800 feet to his right. 2 more Wildcats, flown by ensigns Daniel Sheedy and Edgar Colson, were another 1,000 feet beyond. 4 American fighters in a thin line. 6 Zeros diving fast. Bassett turned toward Thach. Thach turned toward Bassett. At 400 yards separation, both banked hard. Thach left, Bassett right. Their flight paths crossing within 200 feet of each other. To an observer, it looked suicidal, but to Thach, it was geometry in motion, a living figure 8 of steel and courage. 1 Zero picked Bassett and committed to the chase. The Japanese pilot expected Bassett to break away, as every American had before. Instead, Bassett turned toward Thach. At 400 yards, the Zero had him perfectly centered in the gun sight. 3 seconds to kill. Then Thach's Wildcat flashed across from the opposite side, guns blazing. 650 caliber Browning machine guns spat 70 rounds per second. The Zero pilot had one choice: break off or fly into a wall of lead. He broke, rolled hard right, and climbed. For the first time in the Pacific War, Zeros were the ones disengaging. Sheedy and Colson saw it happen. They immediately copied the pattern, turning toward each other, weaving into another figure 8. When a Zero locked onto Colson, Sheedy's guns caught it mid-crossing. A burst of tracers tore through the Zero's fuselage. It exploded in a flash of orange fuel vapor. The dogfight lasted 6 minutes. 6 Zeros versus 4 Wildcats. By every prior statistic, that meant 4 dead Americans. But when the Zeros finally broke off and vanished northwest, all 4 Wildcats were still flying. None hit, none killed. When Thach landed at Ford Island 40 minutes later, his hands were shaking. Not from fear, but from realization. The weave had worked. Geometry had beaten performance. That afternoon, Thach filed a detailed combat report describing the maneuver. He included altitude data, gun camera analysis, and precise distances between aircraft, all calculated from his memory and flight logs. His recommendation was bold: immediate testing and adoption fleet-wide. The reply arrived 3 days later. Interesting tactic. Needs further evaluation. Not approved for operational use. Thach stared at the memo for a long time. 43 pilots had died in February, and command wanted more testing. Meanwhile, the Japanese were planning something bigger. An operation that would test his matchstick trick against odds no fighter pilot had ever faced. Because in 68 days, John Thach would be flying over an island called Midway. Between February and June 1942, Lieutenant Commander John S. Thach drilled his squadron relentlessly. Every dawn over Naval Air Station San Diego, Wildcats clawed for altitude in pairs, tracing invisible figure eights across the sky. What had started as 2 matches on a desk was now a daily ritual. The pilots of Fighting Squadron 3, VF-3, learned to fly so close they could read each other's tail numbers through oil-streaked canopies. Morning flights, afternoon flights, night practice under the moon when it was bright enough to see the horizon. Thach demanded perfection until the pattern felt like instinct. Turn toward your wingman, cross, roll level, turn back, cross again. At 300 miles per hour, the slightest delay could be fatal. The Navy Bureau of Aeronautics still had not approved the tactic. Official doctrine continued to advise avoiding dogfights with Zeros whenever possible, but Thach refused to wait for permission. He taught any pilot willing to listen. From the Enterprise, the Hornet, even Marine squadrons bound for Midway Atoll. He drew diagrams on chalkboards, showed the matches, and explained the geometry in simple words. If a Zero commits to your tail, you turn into your wingman. The Zero must choose. Follow you into his guns or break off. Either way, you live. Some officers grasped it instantly. Others called it reckless. One senior commander told Thach the idea violated the first rule of aerial combat: never fly toward another airplane. You'll panic your pilots and cause mid-air collisions, he warned. Thach only replied, collisions we can train to avoid, funerals we cannot. By May, the Pacific Fleet had lost 91 Wildcats in combat with Zeros. 91 funerals, 91 folded flags. The pattern was still repeating. Yet the Navy's higher command hesitated to rewrite doctrine that had taken decades to build. Then came a break from a basement in Pearl Harbor. Cryptanalysts at Station Hypo, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, intercepted Japanese radio traffic. Code AF, they realized, referred to Midway Island. The decoded orders described a massive carrier assault. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, supported by 2 battleships, cruisers, and over 270 aircraft. The date, June 4th, 1942. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz responded instantly. Every available American carrier was to assemble at Pearl. 3 would make it in time: USS Yorktown, USS Enterprise, and USS Hornet, barely enough to challenge the Japanese armada. For Thach, the orders were clear. VF-3 was assigned to Yorktown, providing combat air patrol to defend the carrier from bombers and Zeros. The math was grim. The Japanese would bring roughly 50 Zeros. The Yorktown could field barely 8 Wildcats. Thach gathered his men in the ready room on May 26th. 7 pilots, 7 Wildcats, 7 men who trusted a trick made from matchsticks. He opened a box, pulled out 2 wooden matches, and crossed them again on the briefing table. This, he said, is how we stay alive. They'll come in greater numbers and from higher altitude. We can't outrun them. We can't outturn them. But we can outthink them. The only way we survive is the weave. One pilot asked what everyone was thinking. What if it doesn't work? Thach looked at the matches. Then at least we die doing something smarter than running away. May 30th, 1942. Yorktown left Pearl Harbor. Her flight deck was scarred from the Battle of the Coral Sea just weeks earlier, yet repair crews had restored her in a record 72 hours. Below decks, maintenance teams tuned the F4F Wildcats. 6 guns, folding wings, armor plate, and rugged radial engines. Though slower than the Zero by nearly 60 km/h, the Wildcat could absorb punishment that would shatter a Japanese fighter. Its self-sealing fuel tanks and heavy structure gave it one advantage: survivability. For 4 days, the task force steamed north toward Midway, shadowed by submarines and long-range patrol aircraft. Thach's men practiced their formations over open water, flying endless weaving drills until the pattern felt like breathing. Even the carrier deck crews learned to recognize the maneuver by the way the Wildcats crossed in takeoff pairs. On June 4th at 0930 hours, radar on the Yorktown reported inbound bogies. 18 Aichi D3A Val dive bombers escorted by 12 Zeros. Thach's 4-plane section scrambled to 14,000 feet. The rest of the cap was already engaged closer to the island. The radio crackled with terse voices, call signs, altitude reports, bursts of static. The Zeros appeared high, 15,000 feet, diving sunward in perfect formation. 3 broke toward Thach's element, 4 toward Bassett's, the rest shielding the bombers below. Odds 3-1. Thach keyed his microphone. Weave pattern, execute on my mark. Bassett acknowledged. 2 more Wildcats held slightly behind. Mark, execute. Thach banked left. Bassett banked right. Their flight paths crossed at 12,000 feet. The leading Zero closed, trying to anticipate the next move, but suddenly found itself head-on with another Wildcat spitting .50 caliber fire. Tracers stitched the Zero's cowling. It burst into smoke and rolled downward. Thach's first confirmed kill. The remaining 2 Zeros adapted quickly. One climbed high, the other dropped low. A classic Japanese pincer attack. Thach counter-climbed toward the upper threat, while Bassett dove after the lower. For 6 terrifying seconds, the pattern broke, both Wildcats fighting separately, exactly what Thach had feared. The high Zero got guns on him at 800 yards. 20mm cannon shells tore through his left wing, 2 hitting the root spar, another shattering the canopy 3 inches from his head. Shards of plexiglass cut his cheek, but he kept turning. Bassett's voice came over the radio. "I'm hit. Coolant leak. Losing power." Smoke trailed from his engine. The lower Zero pressed the attack. Thach abandoned his climb, rolled inverted, and dove to protect his wingman. He came down from the Zero's 7 o'clock high and opened fire at 400 yards. The Japanese fighter exploded mid-air, fragments tumbling through cloud. Bassett's Wildcat shuddered, engine temperature spiking. "Engines overheating. I'm heading for Yorktown," he radioed. "Go," Thach replied. "Take 2 and cover him home." That left Thach alone at 11,000 feet. 1 pilot against 10 remaining Zeros still prowling the sky. The Weave required a partner. Without one, he was a single, slow target. He turned toward Yorktown, descending slightly to maintain speed. 3 Zeros spotted him and moved to intercept. He called for help. 4 Wildcats from another squadron were 3 miles east, too far away. He had seconds. Running would drag the enemy straight to the carrier. Staying meant near certain death. He decided to test whether the principle of the Weave could work solo. Thach threw his Wildcat into a hard right turn, then immediately reversed left. Abrupt, angular movements instead of smooth circles. The lead Zero followed right, overshot, corrected, followed left again, each correction costing speed and altitude. Thach repeated the motion, right, left, right, left. The Zero's advantage in low-speed turning evaporated as it bled energy trying to match the reversals. After 40 seconds of this violent seesaw, the Zero was co-altitude, no longer superior. Its pilot broke off, climbing away. The two wingmen followed. Thach exhaled for the first time in minutes. The concept worked. Even without a partner, constant reversals and unpredictable geometry forced the enemy to react instead of act. He landed aboard Yorktown 20 minutes later. Bassett's damaged Wildcat was already on deck, coolant leaking down the fuselage but still intact. The other two pilots from VF3 crowded the ready room, eyes wide. They had watched Thach's solo fight from above. 3 zeros, 1 Wildcat, 0 losses. Word spread fast. The Weave works, even alone. By nightfall, pilots from Enterprise and Hornet were asking Thach for briefings. He drew the pattern on bulkhead chalkboards, explaining the physics, angles of closure, deflection shooting, energy bleed. That same evening, test flights practiced pair weaves over the dark Pacific. By June 5th, 18 Wildcat pilots could execute the maneuver with precision. By June 6th, 32. Within 48 hours, a trick born from 2 matches was spreading through the fleet faster than any official order. By June 7th, 1942, every surviving Wildcat pilot in the Pacific had heard the name Thach. The story spread from carrier to carrier. 2 fighters crossing paths, gunnery overlap, Zero breaks off. In a matter of days, the Thach Weave became an unofficial doctrine. Intelligence intercepts confirmed even the Japanese had noticed. Radio chatter from enemy fighter groups described new American tactics, coordinated pair maneuvers, crossing patterns difficult to attack. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Navy acknowledged that American pilots had changed. Within 2 weeks, the Bureau of Aeronautics began formally evaluating Thach's combat reports. Charts showed a clear pattern. When pilots used the Weave, the survival rate doubled. When they didn't, it dropped to 0. Still, official approval moved slowly through Washington, trapped between bureaucracy and disbelief. Meanwhile, the Japanese were adapting. Recon pilots reported that American Wildcats now fought in pairs or fours, refusing to break formation. Japanese instructors at Tainan Air Group started developing counters, multi-direction assaults designed to collapse the Weave through overload. Instead of attacking from one direction, they planned to strike from 3 axes simultaneously. Thach predicted this would happen. He spent his next 2 weeks aboard Yorktown demonstrating how to hold the pattern under pressure from multiple angles. He taught his men to prioritize threats. Always cover your wingman first. The Weave fails when fear makes you chase kills. But there was little time to refine the system. Yorktown had been heavily damaged during the Midway battle. On June 6th, she sank under repeated torpedo hits from Japanese submarines. VF3 was reassigned to shore duty, then to new carriers in the rebuilding Pacific Fleet. Thach, promoted to commander, was ordered back to Pearl Harbor to brief Admiral Nimitz himself. He spent June 18th to 20th preparing the presentation. Hand-drawn diagrams, gun camera footage, debriefing transcripts. In a small operations theater at Pearl, he explained how 2 fighters could defeat superior aircraft through synchronized geometry. Nimitz listened silently, then said, "Commander Thach, you may have just given us back the Pacific." The Admiral authorized field testing fleet-wide, but withheld full doctrinal approval pending further data. Thach returned to sea duty aboard the USS Saratoga, commanding a mixed detachment of 8 Wildcats. 3 days later, intelligence brought troubling news. Japanese air groups were training specifically to counter the Weave. Their test scenario was to be over Santa Cruz Island. June 23rd, 1942, 08:15 hours, off Santa Cruz. Skies were clear, seas calm. Thach's section was escorting an Allied supply convoy, 8 Wildcats guarding slow freighters loaded with munitions and aviation fuel. Radar screens aboard the destroyer Phelps lit up suddenly. 18 enemy contacts, approaching from 16,000 feet. Estimated closure speed, 280 knots. Thach climbed with his men. 4 pairs, standard spacing, 600 feet between wingmen, 1,000 feet between pairs. The textbook Weave formation. He didn't know that above them, Japanese Commander Lieutenant Saburo Shindo had arranged his Zeros into 3 groups of 6, high, left, and right. It was the first recorded attempt at a triple-axis counterattack against the Weave. Thach watched the enemy formation through his gun sight as they circled instead of diving. Strange, he murmured into his throat mic. Zeros never waited. They attacked at once, using altitude advantage for the kill. These were waiting for alignment. That's when Thach realized they're coordinating. At 0817, the trap sprang. 6 Zeros dove from above, 6 from the left flank, 6 from the right. 18 fighters converging on 8 Wildcats. For a heartbeat, the sky filled with sunlight and silver wings. "Weave, execute," Thach ordered. His pilots hesitated. Too many directions, too much chaos. Lieutenant Bassett instinctively climbed toward the high group, exposing his right side to the flank attack. Ensign Sheedy broke to cover Bassett's right, which shattered his own link with wingman Coulson. In seconds, the pattern unraveled, exactly what Shindo intended. Thach saw it happening and barked over the radio. "Reform pairs, lock onto your wingman only, ignore other groups, execute standard Weave." The order cut through the panic. Bassett pulled hard toward his partner, finding him through the smoke. They resumed crossing turns just as the high Zeros closed. The lead Zero followed Bassett's tail straight through the pattern into his wingman's guns. A burst of .50 caliber fire punched through the Zero's cockpit. It exploded in midair. The remaining 5 high group attackers broke off, climbing sharply. The left group tried next, diving on Thach's pair. He rolled toward his wingman. Both crossed at 300 yards. 1 Zero committed too deep, flew directly into intersecting fire, and disintegrated. On the right flank, Sheedy and Coulson re-established their Weave just in time. 1 Zero attempted to thread between them, misjudged spacing, and clipped Coulson's wingtip. Both planes spiraled downward. Coulson bailed out, parachute blossoming over the Pacific. 8 minutes after first contact, the sky cleared. The Japanese lost 5 Zeros. The Americans, none killed, 1 pilot rescued. The 3-direction assault had failed. The Weave, even under multi-axis pressure, still worked. Thach knew the significance instantly. He jotted notes midair on a clipboard. Enemy coordinated 3-axis. Result: pattern holds if discipline maintained. Back aboard Saratoga, he filed a detailed report that evening, recommending immediate fleet-wide adoption, no more testing. The data were irrefutable. 8 Wildcats versus 18 Zeros, 5 kills, 0 fatalities. The report reached Admiral Nimitz on June 25th. He forwarded it to Admiral Ernest J. King, Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Fleet. King read the summary twice, underlined one sentence. The Weave functions as a force multiplier. 2 planes achieve the defensive power of 4. On June 29, 1942, Admiral King issued Fleet Order Silk. All fighter squadrons in the Pacific Fleet will immediately adopt the Thach Weave as standard combat doctrine. Training mandatory for all aviators. execution mandatory in all engagements. It was the fastest doctrinal change in naval aviation history. Within weeks, air groups from the Enterprise, Hornet, and Wasp were drilling the maneuver daily. The pattern of crossing arcs became a familiar dance above every carrier wake. Yet orders from Washington took time to filter through every squadron. Not all units had practiced the weave, and the Japanese were still on the offensive. By July 7, 1942, the next test came. Guadalcanal. 12 Wildcats from 6 different squadrons flew combat air patrol over Henderson Field, guarding the fledgling Allied base. 4 of the pilots had trained under Thach. 8 had not. At 11:20 a.m., 32 Zeros approached from the north. Sunlight flashing off their wingtips, the trained 4 immediately paired up and began the weave. The others scattered, each diving into lone dogfights. 22 minutes later, 6 Wildcats were burning wrecks in the jungle below, all 6 flown by pilots who fought alone. The 4 who used the weave survived untouched, shooting down 7 Zeros between them. Their after-action report was blunt. Coordinated maneuver essential, independent combat suicidal. When Vice Admiral John H. Hoover read the report, he ordered every fighter squadron in the South Pacific to master the Thach Weave within 2 weeks. Training began on July 10th. Thach himself flew to Guadalcanal, spending 3 weeks instructing new pilots. Morning briefings, afternoon drills, evening debriefs. He demonstrated the maneuver personally, sometimes at 200 feet over the airfield so ground crews could see the pattern. Keep faith in your wingman, he told them. The weave isn't a trick. It's trust made visible. By August 1st, 96 Wildcat pilots could execute the weave flawlessly. By September 1st, over 200. The tactic spread from the Pacific to the Atlantic, from carrier decks to land bases, even to the U.S. Army Air Forces flying P-38 Lightnings and P-40 Warhawks. Even bomber crews began adapting the crossing pattern for defensive coverage. The results were unmistakable. Before Midway, American fighters had a kill-to-loss ratio of 0.44 to 1. For every 10 Wildcats lost, only 4 Zeros went down. By October 1942, after widespread weave adoption, the ratio flipped to 2.1 to 1. The hunter had become the junta. By the fall of 1942, the sky over the Pacific had changed. The Zero was still faster and more agile, but its myth of invincibility was broken. Every new American pilot learned that agility meant nothing if your target could make you react instead of act. The Thach Weave had rewritten the geometry of aerial warfare. Within months, the tactic spread far beyond the carriers of Task Force 16. The Marine Corps adapted it for defense of Henderson Field, where Wildcats tangled daily with Zeros over Guadalcanal's steaming jungle. The Army Air Forces taught a modified version to P-38 Lightning and P-40 Warhawk squadrons. The Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm adopted it for Seafires and Martlets, flying from British carriers in the Atlantic. In debrief after debrief, the same phrase appeared in the reports. 2 ships crossing, mutual support, no losses. For historians, the numbers tell the story best. In the 6 months before the weave became doctrine, the Pacific Fleet lost 137 Wildcats in air combat with Zeros. In the 6 months after, the total dropped to 41. The difference wasn't new engines or better guns. It was a new mindset. Trust geometry, trust your wingman, don't fight alone. Thach himself no longer saw combat daily. By early 1943, Fighter Command reassigned him to the Naval Air Training Command in San Diego. At first, he hated it. "They're grounding me," he told his wife, "when my boys are still out there." But Admiral Nimitz insisted, "John, you'll save more lives with chalk than with bullets. So the Thach taught. For 18 months, he trained new aviators, over 800 men, in air combat tactics, energy management, and above all, the weave. Every morning at dawn, trainees lined up on the tarmac, engines coughing blue smoke, ready to fly the pattern until their arms ached. "Turn into your partner," he repeated. "Cross, reverse, trust the math." Many of those men would later fly in the Solomons, the Philippines, and the Marianas. They sent him letters, crumpled, oil-stained pages that all said the same thing. "Sir, the weave worked. We made it home." Recognition and reflection. By February 1943, the U.S. Navy formally recognized Thach's contribution. He received the Navy Cross, the citation reading, "For extraordinary heroism and distinguished service in the development of fighter tactics that have saved numerous American lives and contributed significantly to the success of United States naval aviation operations." But medals meant little to him. The number that mattered was survival. Pilots who came home because two aircraft could cross paths at the right moment. Analysts estimated that more than 2,000 aviators owed their lives directly to the weave by war's end. Through 1944 and 1945, the tactic evolved. As newer fighters, F4F Hellcats and F4U Corsairs, entered service, the weave became part of a broader doctrine called mutual support combat. Even as the U.S. gained technological superiority, the principle remained: never fight alone, always turn toward your wingman. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, the Thach Weave was as fundamental to U.S. aerial tactics as the star on the wing. Thach, then 40 years old, faced a choice: return to civilian life or stay in uniform. His wife wanted him home. His children barely knew him. But leaving meant abandoning the mission he had started, the mission to keep new pilots alive. So he stayed. Post-war years and new wars. In 1946, he was promoted to commander, and by 1952, he wore the rank of captain. He never fought another dogfight, but he shaped generations who did. During the Korean War, jet fighters replaced pistons, and air combat moved beyond visual range. Yet the core idea, two pilots protecting each other, remained intact. Pilots flying the F9F Panther and F2H Banshee still practiced cross-turn drills derived from the weave. The newly formed Navy Fighter Weapons School, later known as Top Gun, included the pattern in its early syllabi as a case study in innovation under pressure. By 1960, Thach had become a rear admiral. He commanded carrier groups in the Pacific and Atlantic, but never stopped teaching. He often visited ready rooms, asking young aviators to explain the weave. When they drew the figure 8 on the board, he would nod quietly and say, "Good. You know why you're still here." During the Vietnam War, supersonic jets, like the F-4 Phantom II, faced new threats. North Vietnamese MiG-17s that could outturn them just as the Zero once had. Pilots adapted the weave into a new formation called Fluid 4, 2 pairs of fighters supporting each other with flexible spacing. It used the same core logic. Cover your partner's 6, cross to create intersecting fields of fire, and force the enemy into a defensive loop. The principle that had worked at 300 miles per hour in 1942 worked again at 600 in 1967. A quiet legacy. When Thach retired from the Navy in 1973, he was a 4-star admiral with 40 years of service. He returned to San Diego, bought a small house overlooking the Pacific, and spent his final decades mentoring from afar. Reporters occasionally sought him out for interviews. He always said the same thing. "It wasn't genius. It was desperation. I just wanted my boys to come home." Every February 10th, the anniversary of the first combat test over Wake Island, Groups of naval aviators would call him, some from carriers at sea, others from training bases across the world. They'd thank him, share stories of near misses and saved lives. Thach listened to everyone, always remembering the men who hadn't made it back. In 1981, the U.S. Navy dedicated Thach Hall at Naval Air Station Pensacola, home of its fighter pilot training center. Every aviator earning his wings walked past a bronze plaque bearing Thach's face and 3 words: innovate, adapt, survive. He lived to see the first generation of F-14 Tomcats fly the skies he had once fought over. The Navy made sure every new pilot learned the story of the matchsticks, the moment when thought conquered fear. Thach passed away on April 15, 2001, at the age of 86. His funeral at Arlington National Cemetery drew more than 300 naval aviators. Many were in their 70s and 80s, men who had flown Wildcats and Hellcats. Some had flown Phantoms in Vietnam, others Hornets in the Gulf. They stood silently as the honor guard folded the flag over his coffin. Each knew he was there because of one man who saw possibilities in 2 crossed lines. Epilogue: The Weave Today. Walk through the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, and you'll find a small glass case beside a model of an F4F Wildcat. Inside rests a plain cardboard box of 20 wooden matches. The label reads, Lieutenant Commander John S. Thach used these matches in 1942 to develop the tactical innovation that saved over 2,000 American pilots during World War II. School groups pass by it every day. Most don't stop, but the fighter pilots always do. They look at those matches and understand. In the age of stealth fighters and digital cockpits, the Thach Weave is still taught, not as a primary maneuver, but as a mindset. Mutual support, adaptability, and trust. In every U.S. service, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, the lessons endure. Because combat technology may evolve, but the core truth never changes. 2 pilots turning toward each other will always be stronger than one turning alone.